Unabashed.
The most unpredictable,
Becomes a headline.
the most volatile,
Outrageous behavior.
unsubstantiated narratives.
a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're recording on Tuesday, June 4th, and last week we witnessed the inauguration of a new Indian government, NDA 3.0, also known as Modi 2.0. Joining me to discuss the latest political developments in India is Sadanand Dume of the American Enterprise Institute and the Wall Street Journal. Sadanand, welcome back to the show.
Good to be back.
So I have to begin by asking you a question that has nothing to do with the topic of today's conversation, but you spent all of counting day, May 23rd, 2019, in television studios commenting on the Indian election results. For our listeners who haven't had the pleasure, tell us what that was like.
Well, first of all, I have to say that, if you want India to be run more efficiently, you should just hand over the government to TV news producers because they are absolutely relentless. My day on counting day started at 4:45 in the morning with a phone call from a producer just to make sure that I was awake.
And were you awake?
I was awake, luckily. I was at the studio by about 5:40 in the morning, and I staggered out after 10 p.m.
Wow.
And in between, it was just, we're just there and watching the results come in just like everybody else. And there was a lot of, shall we say, animated conversation. But it was quite, it was in some ways similar to, I did the same thing 5 years ago, albeit for a different channel. And in one way, it was similar in the sense that there wasn't too much of a mystery, right? Within the first 90 minutes or 2 hours, you could see the writing on the wall. You knew that the BJP was coming back. It looked like it was going to be a massive victory. And then the only suspense left was about individual seats. And that kind of went on during the course of the day.
So last week, we finally got a look at the new cabinet of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. There are 57 members of the Union Council of Ministers. Two longtime BJP stalwarts did not make the cut, Arun Jaitley and Sushma Swaraj, both of whom bowed out owing to ill health. But we did see some interesting moves. The two that have generated, I think, the lion's share of attention in the press are the induction of former Foreign Secretary S. Jaishankar as Foreign Minister and the decision of BJP party president Amit Shah to join the government as the Union Home Minister. Give us your top-line reaction to these cabinet picks. What's your overall impression of the new lineup?
Yes, I would agree that those are the two big takeaways. Probably the most significant of all is Amit Shah coming into government, because if the first BJP government was, first Modi government was, very centralized, led by the Prime Minister, a lot of the decision making was happening out of the Prime Minister's office. Here now you have two centers of power. And I think you can see Amit Shah, thanks to the way he has managed the campaign, thanks to the fact that he's seen very clearly as Modi's closest confidant, really emerge as I wouldn't say a co-equal, but a very clear number two. So there's going to be another center of power within government, and that's different from Modi 1.0 in my opinion. The second thing is, the appointment of Dr. S. Jaishankar, who, of course, many of us here in Washington know well. He was a former ambassador over here. As foreign minister is also quite dramatic for a couple of reasons. The first is to take someone who has not been in politics at all, has not been a member of parliament, and catapult this person directly into the foreign minister's job, traditionally a top 4 position in the Indian cabinet. It really shows you how much in control Modi is. Right, in his first term, he had to sort of look around at if you looked at his top 4 ministers, they were all stalwarts of the BJP who had spent many decades in the party. And now I think when he's back in his second term, he really has this kind of presidential kind of authority, and he can just say that, well, look, I want this guy to be my foreign minister, and so be it.
So you wrote a column in the Times of India in January 2018 titled "The Trouble with Sushma. To be a world power that's taken seriously, India needs a superior foreign minister." Explain to us your critique at the time of then Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj, and how would you compare and contrast her with the incoming foreign minister?
So, I feel kind of vindicated because after I wrote that column, I was trolled nonstop for 3 days. And much of this was
including by the minister.
yeah,
herself.
she kind of led the troll attack on me because she took. I mean, it was. I mean, in fairness, I wasn't very nice to her, but it wasn't personal. And the two kind of key points I made was that if you want a foreign minister to be truly effective, it needs to be somebody who has some kind of basic grounding in international politics, right? It requires a certain, you don't have to have a PhD, but you need to sort of be someone who is, to be truly effective, to have a sense of how the world works. And some of the examples I used were, Sahibzada Yaqub Khan, who was General Zia's foreign minister in the 80s and was Pakistan foreign minister in the early 90s also. Ali Alatas, who served Suharto very successfully. And the common ingredients there were that these were people who knew their way around the system. You could take Sergei Lavrov and put him in the same category. They spent some time in the system. They knew people. They knew how things worked. And the second ingredient, which unfortunately Sushma Swaraj did not have, though through no fault of her own, was the confidence of the prime minister, right? And for a foreign minister to carry clout, a foreign minister needs to be able to go into another capital, and the person they're speaking with needs to know that when this person makes a deal, it's something that's going to stick because they have that kind of clout back home. And in India's case, in the first BJP government under Vajpayee, Jaswant Singh really had that. He was known to be Vajpayee's confidant. He was also someone who was very interested in world affairs, world politics, history, and so on. And Sushma Swaraj lacked both of these characteristics. And Dr. S. Jaishankar, in fact, does have both. So that I think that's one of the that's what makes him such a strong choice.
So, kind of stepping aside from the cabinet for a moment, you wrote a piece in last Friday's Wall Street Journal titled "Does Modi Threaten Indian Democracy?" In the piece, you write that with a second consecutive single-party majority in the Lok Sabha, Modi now has virtually unchecked or unlimited power. One of the primary veto players you point to are the opposition-controlled state governments, but you sort of discount the traditional institutional checks and balances, like the media, the judiciary, the opposition and parliament. Why do you think that these have ceased to be effective checks on the prime minister?
I'm not sure if I'd say ceased to be. I think there's kind of, there's been a history here, right? If you go back in Indian political history, you go back to the 1970s and the 1980s. In many ways, if you go back to Indira Gandhi's era, for example, she was a very powerful prime minister, and there weren't really that many checks on her authority. And what we've seen in the post-liberalization era is the media develop more teeth. We've seen the courts develop grab more power from a weak executive. And of course, Parliament, there was always an opposition. And now what we're seeing today in Modi's India is that, first of all, the opposition is completely in a mess, in complete disarray. The Congress has fought. If you total the Congress, the main opposition Congress party seats in both this election and the last election, it's still less than a third of what the BJP won in this election alone. It is less than a tenth of the seats in parliament. So the opposition is in a mess. So it's not clear how much of a role that parliament is going to play in terms of checking the executive power, albeit it's true that the BJP does not have control of the upper house of parliament. Yet. And then, in any case, I don't think it's not necessary that not having control, hurts them that much, because there are many small regional parties and so on that would often just go along with the ruling party on many things. The media, it's not as though there's no room for dissent. You can write op-eds, people do all the time. There is room to criticize the government, but it's also true that this government, rather like Orban in Hungary or several other kind of populist strongmen, Modi has helped stand up a kind of very aggressive, shrill, pro-government media whose main job seems to be to speak truth not to the government but to the opposition. And so they're constantly looking for gaffes by opposition figures and so on. So I think that this development, and this is again something that is not unique to the BJP. In the past, the Congress has also abused the fact that in India the government wields so much power, it's able to arm twist advertisers. It's able to arm twist the businessmen who happen to also be media barons. And now you have a government that just has that much more power. So any government that has more power, it ends up diminishing the power of the media, and that's just the nature of the system. So that's the second. And then the question of the courts, remains up for grabs because over time, it's not clear whether the courts are going to be able to safeguard all of their authority against, in the face of a determined and very powerful executive. So even though the courts in India in some ways are remarkably strong and autonomous because they essentially have judges who choose other judges, unlike in many other systems, nonetheless, the executive does have tools. And many of the people I spoke with in Delhi just after the results, there was a certain amount of concern that the normal checks and balances are really not going to be sufficient in the face of a prime minister who is so popular and so powerful.
You end your piece by writing, quote, Modi may well prove his critics wrong by reining in party hotheads and focusing more on economic growth and less on divisive cultural issues. But until that happens, anxiety about what his mandate means cannot be dismissed. Tell us what you think his mandate actually is.
So I think, that's the point. So it's not as though I'm arguing that, India's democracy is necessarily, going to be hurt grievously. I'm just saying that people who are worried about it, people who do raise these concerns, it's not as though those concerns are baseless. Now, the mandate was for development, continuity, stability, and strong government. It's clear that most people who voted for Modi voted for him because they felt he'd done a reasonable job in the first term, and they felt that he deserved 5 years more. And we've discussed this on your podcast. The fact that the opposition, who's led by Rahul Gandhi, who nobody really saw as a serious contender, also obviously helped Modi and the BJP enormously. So the mandate is for further development, strong government, India that plays a larger role on the world stage, and all of those things. But the part that concerns me is that the mandate does nothing to check what I would call some of the worst instincts of the BJP and the government. So, for instance, you had one of the candidates nominated by the BJP to parliament who actually ended up winning was Pragya Singh Thakur, who is someone who is under trial for terrorism in a case where essentially 6 Muslims were killed in a bomb blast. And the worry, of course, is that not that the mandate is for that sort of thing, but that some of the extreme elements in the BJP are going to be free to interpret the mandate in that way. And that's the thing that sort of worries me, and that's what I believe Modi really needs to keep a check on.
So you're a regular on the show, so you know what comes next. Tell us about a story coming out of India that our listeners may not know about that they should be paying attention to.
One of the things that's interesting is that so much of the focus, which is natural after the election of a new government, has been domestic. But I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens with the RCEP negotiations, which India is participating in, and India has been a roadblock on. This is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a kind of Asian trading bloc. And one of the things that I think would give us a very early clues about this government's economic philosophy is it going to be more like Modi in the first 3 years of his first term, where he sort of seemed to be much more pro-globalization, or are we seeing the trends of the last couple of years where the government looked much more protectionist? I think we're going to see very early signals in terms of India's positions on RCEP, and that I think is interesting and something that the Indian media has not been covering very heavily.
So my nominee for the story that people need to be paying attention to is water, actually. So one of the things which came out of the cabinet selection is the Modi government announced that it would be creating a new ministry, Jal Shakti, which is a merger of the Ministry of Water Resources and the Ministry of Drinking Water. Now, what's interesting about that is that there have been rumblings coming out of Delhi that one of the big pushes that this government would make in its second term in office was the creation of a new national mission for clean drinking water. And if you think about its emphasis on Swachh Bharat, on ending open defecation, this is a kind of natural complement. And I do actually think that this is a pretty powerful idea if they end up pushing for it, because it's almost something that affects really any person who lives in the country. This very tangible sense of what comes out of the tap is something that I shouldn't be putting into my body. And so we'll have to wait and see whether or not this actually translates into real results on the ground. But I think it's actually an interesting story, and I expect that we'll see some big ticket announcements on that front. Who do you think had the best week in India last week?
Probably, I would say Amit Shah. I think that this is his moment where he has emerged almost as a kind of deputy prime minister figure. He's holding meetings on all kinds of issues that are outside of his purview as the home minister. He's the home minister of India, which is traditionally the number 2 position. At least for now, he remains the president of the BJP. So he's had, it's just incredible in terms of the amount of power and authority that he now wields. There's just absolutely no question, even if there was any before this, that this is the second most powerful man in the country.
My nominee would be someone we've spoken about as Jaishankar. I think somebody who had been seen as a troubleshooter on foreign policy issues, as ambassador to China, ambassador to the United States, foreign secretary, someone who left government for a very lucrative private sector post with Tata Sons, brought back to be the foreign minister, I think tells you a lot about what Modi thinks about the man and also his general reputation in the country. There was news coming out today that said that he will likely get a Rajya Sabha seat in the state of Gujarat, which would make another powerful quote-unquote Gujarati in the government. Who do you think had the worst week?
I think Rahul Gandhi's bad month things continue to unspool for him in unfortunate ways. The story about how he managed to lose the family bailiwick in Amethi continues to get attention. You have rumblings of discontent in the Congress. The party seems to be in some kind of limbo where he's making noises about quitting, but it's not clear whether they're going to allow him to quit. And in many ways, this is really, I think that the nightmare of May 23rd is continuing to unfurl in ways that he hasn't come to terms with, and I think that things are going to remain bad for him for a while.
Yeah, I think my loser of the week is the Gathbandhan of the BSP and SP, which was this experiment to create an explicitly anti-BJP pact in Uttar Pradesh, which failed miserably at the hustings this time around. In fact, their combined vote share went down from what it was in 2014. Just today, Mayawati hinted that in upcoming by-elections coming up in the state that she would contest those elections alone. And until and unless she felt that the SP could successfully transfer their vote to the BSP, that they wouldn't be fighting together. Now, interestingly, if you look at some of the post-election survey data, it looks more that she hasn't been able to transfer her vote to the SP. So the SP might have reason also to break off this alliance. But I think it tells you something about how hard it's going to be for the opposition to take on Modi, at least in the existing ways that they know how to. Thanks for joining us, Sadanand. Great to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
After a quick break, I'll be back to talk with economist Sajjid Chinoy on the economic agenda for the new government. My guest on the podcast today is Sajjid Chinoy. Sajjid is the chief India economist for JP Morgan. He also serves on the advisory council to the 15th Finance Commission set up by the Government of India. He is a contributor to a new book published by Juggernaut entitled What the Economy Needs Now, which is a manifesto for the new government, edited by a who's who of experts on the Indian economy, from Abhijit Banerjee to Geeta Gopinath to Raghuram Rajan and Mihir Sharma. Sajjid is hands down one of the most insightful commentators on the Indian economy, and I'm very pleased to have him on the show. Sajjid, thanks for coming on.
Great to be here, Milan.
Let me start by asking you to summarize for us where the Indian economy stands today. We have just had an election in which the ruling BJP of Prime Minister Modi has won a sweeping re-election. Last week, we learned that GDP growth slumped to its lowest level in 5 years at around 5.8%. Tell us about the health of the economy that welcomes Modi to office as he starts his new term.
Well, Milan, I think the economy finds itself at a very interesting dichotomy. As you pointed out, we've just come on the heels of a very strong election mandate. And that's done two things. I think one is, of course, you've seen a noticeable bounce in asset prices. Markets are very excited, from bond markets to equity markets. And we should see, animal spirits, investor sentiment all lift, because such a strong mandate allows the government to contemplate, more transformational measures. It also allows the government space and time to absorb some of the dislocational costs. But even as markets, look forward to that, juxtaposed with this strong market sentiment is a more somber economic reality. We got GDP numbers last week, and what we find is both the quarterly print, which is the first quarter of 2019 calendar year, and the full year 2018-19 were the weakest in 5 years. What we've seen actually is a variety of high-frequency data in the last few months soften. So the economy has lost momentum. It's clear from looking at industrial production numbers, looking at the auto sector, even looking at core inflation, which has softened quite meaningfully. I guess the real question is how much of this loss of momentum is due to temporary factors versus more durable factors. There could potentially be some temporary forces that explain this. One, of course, is for the election uncertainty that characterized the Jan to March quarter, which now goes away. The second is we've had some regulatory changes in the auto sector, which has meant one-off price increases in that sector, and those will play out over time. And the third, we thought, was that government spending was very tight in March to help meet the fiscal deficit number. As it turns out, the fiscal deficit number was met, but government spending was actually quite strong. So there are some one-off forces, but it's equally the case that underlying growth momentum has clearly slowed in recent months. And two things worry me about this. One is we can't really blame this on global growth slowing or global sentiment getting vitiated, because if you look closely at the GDP numbers for the full year, exports actually did very well in 2018-19, growing in double digits for the first time in many years. So this was not pulled down by exports. And therefore, to the extent that the global outlook gets progressively worse or more cloudy, we won't have the benefit of this export growth in the coming quarters, and that could add more pressure. And the second concern is, to the extent that we're in the midst of some slowdown, there is very little policy space to respond. I think fiscal policy just doesn't have any space to respond. And we've seen monetary easing, but for a variety of reasons, that's not transmitting through as yet to the broader economy.
So I want to quote something that you recently wrote, Sajjid. You wrote, quote, "Growth has largely been flying on one engine in recent years, which is private consumption, and that has gotten progressively exhausted, buffeted by sustained rural distress and a significant tightening of financial conditions amongst the non-bank financial companies, or NBFCs." Help break down for our listeners, the softening in the consumption story. Why is this happening right now?
Well, firstly, it's important to underscore that consumption has been the driver of growth over the last 5 years, unlike, in the mid-2000s, where exports were the driver of growth. Exports grew at, 15% or thereabouts for 5 or 6 consecutive years, propelling growth. In the last 5 or 6 years, exports have only grown at about 4.5%. So the burden on growth has fallen on consumption. Now, we've seen actually different reasons why consumption is slowing. Rural consumption slowing is easier to understand because, as many people have noted, agriculture has experienced a sustained adverse terms of trade impulse. Food inflation has fallen much more dramatically than non-food inflation, which is good for urban consumers, but that's hurt farmers' incomes, and so the terms of trade have consistently moved against agriculture for many years now, and that's also manifested in lower wage growth. So it's understandable why rural consumption would slow on the back of this phenomenon. It's the urban consumption story that's more interesting. Urban consumption until a year ago was actually very robust, but a lot of this was increasingly being financed by India's non-bank financial companies, what we call NBFCs. They're akin to shadow banks. And the reason for that is that the Indian banking system went through a necessary but painful deleveraging process where they had to first recognize non-performing assets, then resolve them. Banks had to be recapitalized. So there was a bit of a vacuum that opened up, and NBFCs rushed to fill that, and increasingly were financing lots of leveraged consumption. By last account, they were more than 40% of market share in autos and 40% of the housing sector. And we know what happened to the NBFC sector. There was a large default of ILFS, a large NBFC last September. And ever since then, financial conditions have really tightened against NBFCs. They've struggled to raise funding, both from the market and from the debt market and mutual funds. Also, banks used to lend a lot to NBFCs, but that's come down as well. So NBFC lending has ground to a virtual halt. I mean, the very best NBFCs at the top can still attract funding, but many NBFCs in the middle are unable to attract funding. And there's a bit of a apples problem here. There are concerns that banks and markets have on the solvency of many of these NBFCs. And because they can't distinguish between the good apples and the bad apples, they're not lending to any of the apples. And what that's meant is NBFCs in turn have tried to signal to markets that they're creditworthy by hoarding large amounts of cash. And that's a very inefficient signaling mechanism to markets that here's my cash holdings are so high, please lend to me. What all of this has done, Milan, is essentially slow down disbursements to a halt. And therefore, my sense is urban consumption has slowed, both because demand conditions may be slowing modestly, but a lot of it is because that source of funding to finance some of this leveraged consumption has dried up, and banks, for understandable reasons, aren't completely able to fill the vacuum. So I think the Indian consumption story slowing has many different facets to it.
So I want to pick up something you said about the agrarian side. Now, you said that it's easier to understand the softening of the agrarian consumption story. But what's not so easy is to sort of understand the political impacts of that. I mean, a lot of people, including myself, had said, we have slow growth in farm prices, we have rural wage stagnation, we have a spike in joblessness. These are likely to have some material impact on the BJP's electoral fortunes. Despite all of these factors, we know now that the BJP cruised to victory, and the vote share increase the BJP saw in rural areas was the largest it saw, in compared to urban or semi-urban. Do you think that some of these concerns about agrarian distress have been overblown, or do you think that perhaps people were just voting for other things?
Well, I think if you look at the data objectively, it's hard to make the case that the agrarian stress is overblown. I mean, if you look at where rural wage growth has been the last 3 or 4 years compared to where it was a decade ago, things have clearly slowed. If you look at, as I mentioned, the terms of trade, that's an objective metric over the last 10 years that has continued to move against agriculture. And this is also showing up in the consumption of non-durables, two-wheelers, for example, which is a proxy for the rural economy, also slowing. So there's not too much evidence to suggest that the agrarian stress isn't for real. Now, I know some people will look at agricultural growth and say, well, growth this year was almost 3%, 2.9%, despite it being a drought year. And this came on the back of 5% growth last year. So maybe agriculture is not as bad as we think. And the issue is this is not about volumes. This is about relative prices. And so the pressure was always not on production, which has been strong the last couple of years. It was on whether that production was translating into commensurate income for farmers, because production was going up, but the relative price shock was more than offsetting that increase. I think finally, testimony to the fact that this is a stress point in the economy is the fact that in the very first cabinet meeting, the first decision I think that the new government has taken is to extend the PM Kisan scheme to all farmers. And I think that itself is the best testimony that there is an issue in the agrarian sector. So I think political scientists would be better placed to figure out why this didn't translate into certain voting behavior.
There are a lot of economists advising the new government to do X or Y policy, and I want to ask you to reflect on something you recently wrote for the Business Standard, where you wrote, quote, "Markets are clamoring for stimulus and romanticizing about Big Bang reforms, but the new administration's immediate priority must be to stabilize the economic boat by first fixing the plumbing," end quote. In your view, what is the plumbing that needs to be fixed?
Well, I think it's important to understand the larger economic landscape. We spoke about the fact that growth has lost momentum. We've also experienced some financial fragility with the NBFC sector. We saw how the default of one large NBFC has significantly tightened financial conditions there. We've seen how vitiated the global environment is getting. The trade war has now become multi-pronged and getting broader and deeper by the day. So I'm fully of the view that a strong mandate should result in transformational moves down the line. But I think the first order of business for the government is to fix the plumbing. What do I mean by that? I think there are at least three areas that the government should focus on. One is doing an asset quality review for the NBFC sector. We spoke about the fact that there's a lot of asymmetric information there, a lot of inefficient signaling. And the consequences of that is the NBFC sector isn't lending at all, and that's hurting urban consumption. I think you need the regulator to come in, audit the books, and provide that external, objective, credible signaling mechanism, because only that will break the quote-unquote trust deficit in the NBFC sector, and that will allow funding to go back to that sector. So I think that's an important prerequisite to get consumption going again. Of course, you have to then simultaneously plug the regulatory arbitrage between banks and the NBFC sector. So I call that plumbing. And we realized with the banking sector a few years ago that the more you delay this problem, the bigger it gets down the line. The second issue of plumbing is the GST. Again, it's a transformational reform. I have no doubt that it's going to hugely improve productivity growth down the line. But the first order of business is to simplify the GST and significantly tighten compliance so that the budget every year is not held hostage by non-compliance with GST. We had the fiscal numbers for 2018-19 released last week along with the GDP numbers, and we find that gross tax collections were short by almost 1% of GDP, and that was because the center's GST collections were short by almost 0.8% of GDP compared to what they were budgeted. Now, what this does is without better compliance, it creates constant fiscal uncertainty through the year, and bond markets worry and get anxious, and they put in a risk premium into bond yields, they price in a risk premium, and that keeps the cost of capital elevated. And the second thing is, when in fact these tax collections, or if they don't materialize, then the government is forced to scramble in the months of February and March, and sometimes or often cut public investment, which also hurts growth because public investment has the largest fiscal multipliers in the economy. So at least the two clear areas that require supply-side plumbing is to simplify and tighten compliance in the GST, to initiate at the appropriate time an asset quality review for the NBFC sector. I would think along with the GST, a credible budget is very important at this point, just to reassure markets, because given the numbers that showed up for 2018-19, the revenue numbers that were budgeted for 2019-20 now seem unviable and would need to be reworked. The last part of the plumbing, so to speak, is to ensure, we're seeing early signs that wholesale food prices are going up. And I think in the past, governments have rightly worried about food inflation going up and tried to clamp down. But I think some normal increase in food prices is warranted to reverse those terms of trade. And others have written that things like the Essential Commodities Act, for example, should be scrapped. There should be no restrictions on stock holding or export. So I consider all of this to be plumbing. It's not something that, necessarily always makes the front pages or excites markets or is classified as big bang reform. But for me, this is crucial in the next 6 months to both stabilize growth, bring credibility to fiscal management and therefore bond yields and borrowing costs, and to reduce financial fragility in the NBFC sector and thereby restart lending for consumption.
Sajjid, let me ask you one last question that has to do with the global economy. You know, your contribution to the new book, edited by Abhijit Banerjee and colleagues, looks at India's external environment. And we've seen a lot of volatility in the international space, whether it's the U.S.-China trade war, recent tensions between India and Pakistan, oil prices, which are, still low from historic levels, but have slowly crept up a bit. In your mind, what are the major risk factors that India needs to consider from abroad? What are those things that are emanating from outside which should keep government economists up at night?
Well, one is that we're just in the midst of a lot of global uncertainty. Markets can go risk off and risk on very quickly. Something happens to U.S.-China trade war, and there are capital outflows from all emerging markets, and the dollar gets stronger. So really, even though these global events don't directly concern India, we certainly feel the collateral damage. So what are the things we can do? I think the first is the Hippocratic Oath, which is do no harm, which is just to keep focusing on the macro fundamentals, because what we've seen in all of these stress episodes in the last decade is, at first blush, capital flows out of all emerging markets, but then investors reassess and tend to reward emerging markets with good macro stability and good macro fundamentals. So this is just making sure that, all macro fundamentals are under control, inflation, the current account deficit, and fiscal policy. I think the second is to focus and ensure that external imbalances don't get too wide. We had a bit of a scare in 2018 when oil prices, went above $80 a barrel, and the current account deficit began widening towards 3% of GDP. So we need to ensure that the current account doesn't approach anywhere close to 3% of GDP in this global environment. And there are, I think, two ways to try and address that. One is ultimately the current account is nothing but investment minus savings, right? And one of the reasons the current account has improved is because private investment has fallen so much. Now, the hope is, especially after such strong election results, that 4 or 6 or 8 quarters down the line, you will see some private investment activity. And at that point, it's very important for the government to retreat its fiscal deficit so that any pickup in private investment is not accompanied by a widening current account deficit. The second, more tactical measure, and this is something I have in my chapter in the book, which is we've also become so hostage to oil prices. When oil prices move up and suddenly India's macro fundamentals don't look so good, or oil prices come down and capital comes rushing in, then we have a problem of plenty. And what I've been advocating for a while is why not we try and mitigate or manage this risk like other emerging markets by trying to hedge oil prices in global financial markets, because these markets are now deep enough and liquid enough for India to embark on a systematic program of hedging oil prices over many years. Other economies have done this as well. Mexico, for example, of course, Mexico is an oil exporter. We're an oil importer, but Mexico has shown how this can be done. So I think if you hedge oil prices, you take away one key source of uncertainty. So I would say, it comes down to just ensuring that none of India's macroeconomic balances go out of whack. I think that's the best line of defense. And that's the one final thing. In an environment where global trade wars may get deeper and broader, that may legitimize other emerging markets from imposing tariffs, for example. But I think we should certainly refrain from that. I think the case for unilateral trade liberalization is still very strong from an economic efficiency perspective. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of that.
The book is called What the Economy Needs Now. It is online and in bookstores, published by Juggernaut Press. Sajjid, I know that your services are in great demand, both from clients as well as from the government. Really grateful that you could take time out to join us. Thanks for coming on the show.
Real pleasure, Milan. Thank you.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Jamie Hinson and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin's our audio engineer, and Lauren Duax our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.